Hello, this A-level English language video is all about language discourses. So this is an introduction to that subject and it's getting you prepared for the AQA English language paper 2. Now this is how it fits into the architecture of the whole course. It's not, discourses is not on paper 1. Paper 1 was all about meanings and representations and it's all about children's language development. What it is, it's on paper 2. Now, paper 2 is called Language Diversity and Change, 2.5-hour paper. First section, good old-fashioned essays. So, diversity and change. So you either write an essay about language diversity or about language change. Section B is your language discourses. So this is where you analyse and compare two pieces of journalism, and then you get to create your own piece of journalism. So it's a fair weight of the overall assessment on the course, since that whole paper is 40% of your English language A-level. Let's look in detail at the actual questions themselves. So, as I said, an hour and 45 minutes, 2 questions. So you're given 2 texts, and these 2 texts are about language. So that makes them different from the meanings and representations text that you've been looking at. So they are discussions about English language topics, and they are not written for A-level English language students, nor for undergraduates, nor for specialists. They are written for non-specialists. So they are usually pieces of journalism. So there are a couple of examples. A Daily Telegraph article about the influence of American English on British usage, coupled with a Daily Mail news article about Americanisms. So it's useful to know about the background of some of these publications so that you've got a fair idea about the implied audiences, the target demographic. The Daily Telegraph, for example, is a right-wing conservative supporting broadsheet newspaper that's aimed at middle-aged and older people. And the Daily Mail is similar in the sense that it's a right-wing conservative supporting newspaper, but it's a tabloid. It's a blue top tabloid newspaper. So they're quite significant contextual factors on the language. They will have an impact on the way that the journalists have used tone and the ideas that they've used in their articles. And in this example, it's about American English, which is a topic that you will look at when you're doing about language change. There's the question. Analyse how language is used in text A and text B to present views about the, whatever it is. So it's comparative. So look at your AOs on the bottom there, and you will see that this is a question that is marked out of 40. So AO1 is 10. Now AO1 is your linguistic terms. Do you know your epistemic modal auxiliary verbs from your second person pronouns? This is your opportunity to show that you do, that you are not just a common or garden GCSE student snuck in on the course. So AO1, which gets 10 out of 40, is about linguistic terms, and it's also about your written expression as well. The technical accuracy of your writing, but also like the cohesion and the structuring. So that's AO1. Now your AO3 is about your understanding of meanings and representations, the ideas that are going on in the texts, the discourses that are going on in the texts. Okay, and alongside that on AO3 is context. So what are the contextual influences that are dictating the language that's going on, whether that be audience or purpose or genre or wider situational contextual factors. Finally, last but by no means least, you have AO4, which is comparison. Okay, so that gets 15 out of the 40 marks. Now, what you can't do on this question 3 in your response is write for 2 sides about text A, and then write for a side about text B, and then do a bit of a conclusion where you do a bit of comparison. No, 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 don't do that. It needs to be comparative all the way through. Paragraph 1, paragraph 2, which means that you've got to have really good comparative topic sentences. More on that later in another video. Now, that's your question 3. This is your question 4. Write an opinion text, an article, about, and it'll be the same subject as you've just analysed, or question 3, in which you assess the ideas and issues raised in text A and text B, and you argue your own views. So if you are argumentative, this question is designed for you. But have a look at those AOs on the bottom there. This gets a mark out of 30. Remember, your question 3 got a mark out of 40. So this one gets a mark out of 30, so you spend less time on it, about 45 minutes. And 10 out of those 30 marks are for AO5, which is creativity and your ability to write in an engaging way for your audience and your purpose and your genre. Now, the other 2/3 of the mark are for AO2. So this is about linguistic concepts. Okay, so this is difficult because what you've got to do is marry together this engaging, journalistic, lightweight style with the kind of heavy knowledge that you've accrued on this course so far about English language. For example, about gender theory, okay, stuff that you were learning on the language diversity part of the course. Okay, so let's open the box of discourse. What do we actually mean by discourse? It's a difficult word because it's polysemous. Polysemy means it's got multiple meanings. I mean, we know, of course, that discourse is one of our language levels, but here, the meaning of discourse on this particular bit of the course is a little bit different. It can be defined as a way of thinking about, talking about, arguing about, describing how we feel about something. That's your discourse. So, for example, let's say you're talking about sport or politics. You may well use a discourse of conflict. You may well use metaphors, such as the material verbs ambushed, attacked, and fought, and they are describing actions perhaps on the football field, or perhaps even the Houses of Parliament. So the language that you use there is positioning the audience to think and feel that football and politics is all about conflict. That is discourse. Okay, so it's linked in very much with power. When we talk about power, we often mention the linguist Norman Fairclough, Storm and Norman. So discourses help to frame the way that we think about the world. And in the viewpoint of Norman Fairclough, he argues that language is all about power. So language is centrally involved in struggles for power. And so he goes on to argue that ideologies are closely linked to language, because language is the commonest form of social behaviour where we rely on common sense assumptions. So it's the power of influential power in order to persuade the audience to think and feel in certain ways. So discourses and power are closely linked together. You're never very far away on discourses from the difference between prescriptive and descriptive attitudes. Now remember the difference between them. So a prescriptivist dictates how people should speak and write, whereas a descriptivist avoids passing judgments and provides explanation and analysis. So if you think of a prescriptive viewpoint, let's take the phrase, I didn't do nothing wrong. I didn't do nothing wrong. Now a prescriptivist would say, look, that is bad, sloppy, lazy English. Why are you speaking in a non-standard way? It's going to be confusing and difficult for people to understand. If you use these double negatives, like I didn't do nothing wrong, what does that actually mean? Do we apply the rules of maths, where two negatives make a plus? Do you actually mean that you did do something wrong? Can you imagine if everybody used dialectical forms like this, non-standard forms? Nobody would be able to understand each other. Okay, so the prescriptivist is dictating how people should speak and write, and there are plenty of people who have a prescriptive viewpoint. Now, your descriptivist takes a different approach. They try and avoid passing judgment, and what they're trying to do is explain and analyse. So they're looking at the double negative, I didn't do nothing wrong. They notice that this is a non-standard feature, and therefore on many occasions it would be inappropriate to be using that. For example, when you're writing your UCAS personal statement, but nevertheless it's a speech conversational feature, and the double negative there is for emphatic purposes. So clearly it is being used as a negative, And maybe a descriptivist would say, well, it follows in a long line of great writers using double negatives, because we have instances of Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare, and going back even further in time, Geoffrey Chaucer, using all sorts of double, triple, multiple negation for emphasis purpose. You could do a bit of sort of cross-linguistic comparison there as well and say, look across the Channel at the French. Embedded in their language is a double negative, ne pas. Okay, so what the descriptivist here is doing is not so much passing judgment on the person who's using the double negative, but trying to explain and analyse it. And that's broadly what we try to do on the English Language A-Level course. So, in the words of the wonderfully alliterative Henry Hitchings, one says what ought to happen, which is the prescriptive viewpoint, and the other one says what does happen, which is the descriptive viewpoint. Now, obviously, I've put them apart as if they're kind of like binary opposites, and what you're going to get clearly in articles is a mixture and opinions that are somewhere in the middle, so neither completely prescriptive nor completely descriptive. This is a continuum, it's a climb. Okay. We move on to common discourse metaphors about language. Now, this is important. When we're looking at articles, can we identify the discourses that the journalists are using? Perhaps a journalist is using the discourse of correctness, where they're writing about language as if it's either right or wrong. It's either correct or incorrect, right? Double negative, wrong. That's the discourse of correctness. Maybe the journalist is drawing upon the discourse of morality. So here, language use is seen as being either intrinsically good or bad, and therefore its users as good or bad people. We have the aforementioned discourse of conflict. So arguments about language are often framed as being about two sides in opposition, which is quite ironic when you're talking about language, which is supposed to be a bridge of communication between people, that so often it's presented in terms of conflict, usually in quite a hyperbolic way, a sensational way, in order to entertain and thrill the reader. We have the discourse of decline, where language is often presented as undergoing a kind of steady decline from its once great peak in the past. We have other metaphors, such as the metaphor of pollution, that language is represented as once being pure, but now being infiltrated and at risk of pollution. And that links in maybe with infection and disease, where language change or language variation is seen as a sort of threat to the health of the language. It's weakening the language and it's damaging it. Add to that invasion. So this is the idea that language is seen as being under threat from outside forces. These are just examples of common discourse metaphors. This is not a definitive list. Here's a task for you. We have some discourses on the left. We have some statements on the right. You have to match the discourse on the left with the statement on the right. I would ask you to pause the video there and link them. Right. I'm assuming that you've paused the video and had to think about them. So let's talk about the answers then. So in terms of evolution, we've got languages can crossbreed in a way that species do not. Okay, now, so here's quite a descriptive statement, because what it's showing is the flexibility of language, that languages can crossbreed, so therefore we've got things like lexical borrowing, where we are borrowing words from other languages, e.g. pajamas, which comes from Hindi. And also grammatical change as well. Our grammar has changed over time. So what it's doing is it's explaining and analysing how languages change, but it's not passing judgment and being critical about it. So it's therefore quite descriptive in its tone. Disease. English has been infected and weakened by text messaging and online abbreviation. Now notice the way that English is being positioned here. So it's foregrounded at the beginning of the sentence, but the passive voice verb has been used, has been infected and weakened. So poor old English. And this links into the work of another linguist that we'll explain a little bit more about in another video, Jean Aitchison, who came up with a set of analogies about the way that people usually complain about other people's language. And this fits in with her infectious disease analogy. Okay, so in this case, an outside influence, language and technology, text messaging and online work, has been blamed. So we've got this heavily prescriptive viewpoint. Decay. The English language is like a crumbling castle, a once great building, now on the verge of collapse. Now this is another one of Jean Aitchison's analogies. Okay, the crumbling castle. That once upon a time, English was a fine, beautiful structure, and it's degenerated over time because of people's sloppiness and laziness. So this is strongly prescriptive. It's this nostalgic notion that sometime in the past, I wonder when, sometime in the past there was this golden age of language. And so this simile that we've got suggests the complete collapse of the language is imminent. It's crumbling. It's on the verge of collapse. Finally, purity. English has become polluted by ugly Americanisms. So this is the prescriptive idea that English in the past was pure and that American English is aesthetically bad for the language. So focusing on that pre-modifying adjective, ugly. So this is a very subjective pre-modifying adjective. It's not a factual, objective statement. It's subjective. Look again at the use of the passive voice, right? So something has been done to English. It's the victim of this thing. The passive voice is used. It portrays language as a kind of victim of outside corrosive influence. And then we've got conflict. Standard English is now in a state of war against the invaders. American English, online slang, and Jafaican. So hyperbole is the name of the game here. I mean, journalists do this, and part of the reason why they're doing it, they are trying to capture the interest of the reader, who may not be all that bothered about language issues. So here we've got a kind of hyperbolic slogan that's being used. Again, we've got this notion of conflict, and there is an irony in that this tool for communication between people is represented as this weapon of war. And blame is being attached, and the blame is being attached to the usual suspects, technology and other cultures. Now notice here the non-linguistic pejorative label Jafaican. So when this is represented in newspapers, really it means MLE, Multicultural London English. But Jafaican itself is an interesting pejorative label because it suggests that these people's language is somehow inauthentic, that it's artificial and contrived, and that it's not real. Okay, that's given you a little bit of an introduction to the language of discourses. In our next videos, we will take this even further. Thank you very much.